A few years ago, while I was buying a sideboard, the seller offered to throw in this little mid-century sewing table for an extra 20 euros. At the time, I didn't know what I was going to do with it, but for just 20 euros, I knew that sooner or later I would eventually find a use for it. Fast forward to Christmas 2025, and I'm going to restore it as a gift for my girlfriend's mother. And although it's nothing too special, it is a great opportunity to demonstrate how a good refinish can totally transform an otherwise boring piece of furniture into a real head turner. I'm going to remove these beech legs first because they don't actually need to be stripped or sanded, and I'm also going to remove this little brass handle, which I think I will probably replace with something else after everything else is done. Because this mahogany veneer on the interior is in such good condition, I'm going to seal it off with painter's tape before I start with the paint stripper on the outside. Although, before I do that, I'm going to clean off the outside with alcohol as well, to ensure that the stripper can do its job effectively. The veneer is walnut, which is something a little different for me, and it seems to have a pretty thick layer of lacquer on it, so it's probably going to be a little bit of work getting it all off. I've also just noticed that this joint on the front is coming apart, so before I move ahead, I'll put some fast drying wood glue in there and clamp it up for an hour or so. Technically, this glue only needs a clamp time of about 5 minutes at room temperature, but longer is always better when it comes to glue. The veneer is in pretty good overall condition, but it is definitely scuffed and faded, and so even though there are no major scratches, it's got that worn, cloudy look to it, and so there's really no way of saving this piece without removing all of that old lacquer first. That being said, I think I left the stripper on for too long because it was getting a bit sticky and became difficult to scrape off cleanly, and so I'm just going to have to do some extra scrubbing and sanding. I'll start with 150 grit pads on the machine because there's still quite a bit of leftover lacquer that I didn't get off with the stripper, although I'll still need to be careful around the edges. I could have sanded the entire piece by hand, but because I won't be making any money on it, I do need to manage how much time I invest into it. I'm using a combination of 180 grit sandpaper and a 180 grit sanding sponge to sand all the edges and corners which are too delicate for the machine. The regular sandpaper is great for areas where the surface needs a bit more force and pressure, whereas the sponge is great for corners and edges where you need a lighter touch to avoid sanding flat patches into the veneer. Being a small piece without any significant damage though, the sanding didn't take too long, and so now it's time to add some stain. I did consider skipping the stain on this job, but because the top was more sun bleached than the sides, I decided to use some walnut oil stain to bring everything into closer alignment. This particular stain can be very dark though, and so I've cut it down to about 30% with mineral spirits so that it doesn't mute or neutralize the natural qualities of the walnut wood grain. With the stain drying, I'll give the legs a quick coat of shellac, followed by some treatment with the walnut stain. It's not going to have a huge impact, but it will help darken them a little bit, so that they're closer to the color of the table. So for the finish on this, I'll be going for a pure shellac finish, and so I guess you could call it a French polish, although I won't be filling out the pores and making it super glossy or anything like that. I will be adding layer upon layer of shellac though, until I've built up a level I'm happy with, and so we're probably talking about 6 to 8 coats in total. I'm starting out with garnet shellac here, which is de-waxed and has a much lighter color. I'm keeping the mixture really thin to start with, so about 85% alcohol, to make sure that I'm not getting streaks and buildups and stuff like that. I have used a traditional shellac pad in the past, but these days I just use a cotton cloth to wipe it on, same as most of the other finishing products I use. It's just my personal preference. Even with such a thin mixture though, I still have to do a little sanding between coats sometimes, just to get rid of any little ridges or runs, because once you've covered them with a few more coats, they'll become very difficult to sand out again. At this point though, it's really just about layering the finish. After 3 coats of garnet shellac, I'm now switching to lemon shellac because I want a little more richness and depth in the color. The shellac will bond to itself and eventually cure into one single layer, but you can push the color in different directions as you go, and you can influence how glossy it's ultimately going to be by what blends of shellac you use. Because lemon shellac is unfiltered and contains natural waxes, it will give a slightly more satin or medium gloss sheen than blonde or garnet. And so I always feel that this gives a more natural, earthy look, which is really enhancing the walnut wood grain here. That being said, for the final 2 coats, I'm now going to switch to blonde shellac. The reason being is that it tends to dry a little harder than the other variants, and so it makes for a good top coat. I'm not too worried about the sheen here because it hasn't gotten too glossy, and so I just feel it adds a little bit of extra durability for a piece like this, which isn't going to have a heavy top coat. Normally shellac dries pretty quickly, but because it's been getting so cold up here and because I'd layered on so many coats, I ended up leaving it for about 48 hours to dry off before giving it a final sand with the 320 grit sanding sponge. I'm using Brie wax in the color of antique brown to polish it with, which is a great product for creating a warm antique patina for a project like this. I've got super fine steel wool here, and I'm really just using as little as possible and trying to make each little bit stretch out as far as it will go in order to create an even sheen and avoid creating streaks or patches or anything like that. The idea is that when it comes time to buff it back off again, you shouldn't really be having to wipe anything off, and so using the polishing rag, I can now buff it in a circular motion and really drive the wax into the wood grain without having to worry about creating streaks. But as you can see, there's really not much to it, and although it may not look radically different, it's definitely got a more fresh and vibrant look than before, and so it's a much more attractive piece of furniture to have sitting around. If you've made it this far and you want to support the channel, please do like and subscribe. The next video is going to be a really challenging project, and so I'm really looking forward to sharing it with you guys. Until then though, thanks for watching.